This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome to Class 1 of the Olivet Prophecy. Okay. So here we got Herod's temple. So they rebuilt around and over. So they didn't stop the temple services for the construction. They managed to find a way. I'm not quite sure. Don't ask me the details of how they managed to navigate that. I don't know. But that's what they say. They managed to find a way to do all of those things. But at the beginning of chapter 24, we have this incident where the disciples are showing Jesus the buildings of the temple, or in Luke's account in Luke 21 verse 5, it says they were showing Jesus, they spoke to Jesus about how the temple was adorned with goodly stones and gifts. And we get a bit of a sense of the perspective of a worshipper into the temple complex. So it's not just a building, it's a whole complex of buildings, and how impressive a sight the temple was. It was just magnificent. Well, it was one of the wonders of one of the famous iconic wonders of the world in that age. And so they show that to Jesus, and they're extolling the great marvels of this building. To which Jesus responds in Matthew 24 and verse 2, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say to you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." So you might think that that's like a little bit dour, or a bit of a maybe, not quite in the spirit of what the disciples were showing. But the Lord is trying to get them to understand that the world that they know is going to change, and going to change in a way that is good, difficult for them to comprehend. So this statement here is then what prompted, because we then have in verse 3, it says that as they sat down, let's have a map. Here's a map of Jerusalem. So I don't know if you can see this, but one of the things I just want to note on here, the map of Jerusalem, is how much the temple complex dominates the city. So the temple complex is in that sort of middle, the upper right part of the map. And so it's an enormous platform, and in the center of that is the temple building, and then obviously the Holy of Holies. And it just dominates the cityscape, the temple. And on the far left corner of the temple is the fortress of Antonia, so which then dominates that whole area. So a lot of in the ministry of Jesus, when we read about Jesus going to the temple, not obviously going to the central building, but he's going to that complex. Which was where people would congregate for all sorts of things. So this is the area where they are, and so now they've showed him these things, and the Lord has made that comment, and then they've left. They've left the temple complex, and they've gone up to the Mount of Olives, which is just to the right. So if you can just see the title of City of David, just above that it says Mount of Olives. So Mount of Olives, they could be there, and they're on the temple side of Jerusalem, and they can look over the Jerusalem and over the temple area. And while Jesus is sitting there, 4 disciples, as Mark tells us, 4 disciples come to Jesus, and it says they come privately. They come privately to Jesus, and they've got a question. They need some clarification. Like, what is this thing that you're talking about? Like, just what? It says that the disciples came privately, asking him, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" Of course, our understanding of the Olivet prophecy really hinges around these 2 things. The words of Jesus, where he says, this is all going to be torn apart, and then the question, well, what questions are the disciples asking? So what question is Jesus answering? when he goes on to give this this prophecy. But before we look at the questions, it's useful for us just to consider the background of the events that have led up to this point, because we actually get an interesting and useful context, I suppose, for what the Lord is going to say. So here we are. We'll just very briefly. So we're not going to go through all these things. One of the challenges with the Olivet prophecy is that the story of the Olivet prophecy touches every part of New Testament history. And it touches all the books of the New Testament and a considerable number of parables and a lot of the teaching of Jesus, as well as even before we've got to the Old Testament, any Old Testament prophecies. So we'll just see how we go. But anyway, so John 12 tells us that 6 days before the Passover, they were in Bethany, and so that's the supper, and where Mary uses the alabaster box, anoints Jesus' feet. So that's that, 6 days before the Passover. So later in that chapter, in verse 12, it tells us that the triumphal entry was the following day. So the triumphal entry was 5 days before the Passover. And before leaving the city before returning to Bethany, Luke 19 tells us that's where Luke 19 occurs, where Jesus weeps over the city and says, if you knew the time of your visitation and the things that belong to your peace, but they're hidden from you. And Jesus weeps over the city because in that place it's going to be destroyed because they didn't know the time of their visitation, the coming judgment on Jerusalem. Well, Matthew 21 tells us that they went back to Bethany, and then the next day was the day where, on the way into Jerusalem, they got to see the fig tree. So there's the fig tree where Jesus goes to look for fruit, and there's no fruit. Curses the fig tree. It's got all the leaves, looks like it should have fruit, doesn't. Curses the fig tree. There's a cleansing. Mark tells us that there's a cleansing of the temple. Matthew actually has that on the day of the triumphal entry. Mark has it the following day. I put it on that day. You can decide whether it was on days 4 or 5, whichever. Then in Mark 11, it tells us that we're now 3 days before the Passover. He comes to Jerusalem, and the 3rd day before the Passover, there's a lot of information in the Gospels about this 3rd day before the Passover. So this is the day where the Lord comes in, and the priests are questioning about his authority to cleanse the temple. So you've turned over the money changers, cleaned everything out. What's your authority to do this? And Jesus answers them and silences their criticisms, their questions. Jesus then tells the parable of the vineyard. The vineyard sends his servants, finally sends his son, who was murdered, and then the husbandman, the owner of the vineyard, comes and destroys the husbandman and says he's going to let them out to other husbandmen who will render his fruits in their season. And the Jews perceived that Jesus spoke that parable against them. They knew he was talking about them, that they were the wicked husbandmen. Then in Matthew 22, Jesus tells the parable of the wedding feast. We've got the people, the servants go out to invite, and they are rejected. And finally, they're spitefully used, and even some of the servants are killed. And then it says that the king will then send his armies to destroy their city. And then there's more servants go out to invite people and other people to the feast. That's the parable of the wedding feast. Then there is the silencing of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians at the end of Matthew chapter 22. So there's all those other questions, in the resurrection, the woman with 7 husbands, 7 brothers. That's all. That's that section. Then there is the public condemnation of the Pharisees. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. So Matthew 23, the Lord eviscerates the false hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees. I mean, it's just brutal. Like if you're on the end of that, like you would not feel good about, you wouldn't be going away feeling good about Jesus if he'd spoken those things about you, and clearly they didn't, even though they were true. After that, so by the way, there's coming condemnation for the scribes and Pharisees who were hypocrites. After that, they're sitting in the temple complex, story of the widow with the 2 mites. Then there's some Greeks go to see Jesus, and then Jesus talks about the judgment, how the judgment of this world has come and the prince of this world is cast out. That's John 12. And that's the point. So this is now this is where they are leaving the temple complex, and it's at this stage that the disciples are showing Jesus, the amazing stones, the big gift, like the beautiful buildings, like this is amazing, like isn't this so completely impressive? And the Lord must have been thinking, like, have you not been listening? Have you not been listening to like anything that's happened over the past 3 days? Because the impressive, however impressive these stones are, it's all going to be destroyed. Like, have you not been listening? So Jesus is very blunt, replied to them about that, which must have shocked them a bit. And so Jesus says at the end of Matthew chapter 23, behold, your house is left to you desolate. And then they go to, they leave the temple complex and they go up the Mount of Olives. And that's the point where the disciples, Peter and Andrew, James and John, go to privately to Jesus and say, can you just explain this? Can you just explain this for us? Like, when's this going to happen, and what's going to be the sign? So that's just a very brief background, but the overwhelming weight of what happens and the teaching of Jesus during this time is of judgment to come. I think we're at the sharp end of the ministry. There is a condemnation for those people who are rejecting Jesus. They're rejecting their Messiah. So just in case we'd forgotten, here we go. Here's a model, a replica of Herod's temple. Beautiful building, amazing. And yeah, 46 years building. Josephus says that it carried on being built and renovated. Whether that was just standard renovations, but at least 46 years to build the temple, and Jesus says it's all going to be torn apart. So that's the comment that they made at the very beginning of Jesus's ministry. And then in the background, overshadowing the temple complex, as maybe might be considered a sinister reminder of the situation, was the tower, which you can see just here in the background, is the fortress of Antonia. So that was where the Roman troops were garrisoned, and they dominate that which gave them rapid access both to the temple core complex and also the different parts of the city, in case they needed to get there quickly to suppress any sort of rebellion. Because so I'm sure you're all familiar with New Testament history. The Jewish people were, it was not unusual for riots to erupt or for passions to run high and need to be suppressed. So
a bit like 2023.
So like it's in the anyway. So they had a fortress. There's a fortress there stuffed full of Roman soldiers, just there in the background. Here we are. So the question. Let's just have a think about the question. So here we are. So they've been doing this. Not one stone is going to be left upon another. So then the disciples ask this question: when shall these things be? So if we put the three records together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find that there's kind of two components to the question. So the first component is when shall these things be, and the second component is when shall be the sign. Now Matthew's got these kind of two parts of the sign of thy coming and the end of the world, which Mark and Luke call when shall be the sign, what shall be the sign when these things shall be fulfilled. So the sign when these things shall be fulfilled seems to be explained by Matthew as the coming and the end of the world. So if we start with the first one to begin with, so start with the easy one first. When shall these things be? So if you think, well, what are these things of what the disciples were asking about? Well, it's reasonably straightforward. These things that the disciples were asking about is verse 2 of Matthew 24. There shall not here be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. In fact, it's probably actually broader than that, because it actually encompasses the judgment teaching that Jesus has actually given to the disciples and to the people over the past 3 days, recorded in Luke 17 and 19 as well, or even actually just back across in Matthew 23, where the Lord says that in verse 34, it says of Matthew 23, wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them you shall kill and crucify, and some of them you shall scourge in your synagogues and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel and the blood of Zacharias, the son of Berechias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stone them that come and are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you would not? Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, you shall not see me henceforth till you say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. So they could also include those things as well, those sort of grim promise of the end of chapter 23. So let's just hold that thought for a moment and have a little bit of a think about the 4 disciples. So we've got 4 disciples. So Mark gives us their names. This is Peter and Andrew, James and John. Does anybody know anything about the audience participation? Does anybody know anything about these 4 disciples? Yeah, 2 pairs of brothers. So Peter and Andrew are brothers, and James and John are brothers. So that's in John chapter 1, I think. But 2, sorry? Yeah, and they both ran a fishing business. Well, I think it's probably John's family was the key part of that. So two sets of brothers, which is actually notable for later on where Jesus talks about brothers betraying brothers. So maybe they kind of looked a bit oddly at each other. But anyway, that's for later on. So one of the things that I think we've probably noticed as we go through the Gospels, and this is, by the way, this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, is that where it's pointed out for us the things that the disciples don't understand and that they don't know about. And so, like I said, there's plenty of things that we could add that could be added to this. This is just a selection of particularly relevant ones. But for example, it also says Luke says after triumphal entry that they didn't understand those things. Things about the triumphal entry. I haven't put it here, but that's in Luke. So they didn't understand in Luke 18 that it says that they didn't understand that Jesus was going to be crucified, that he had to die. So Jesus was talking to them on the way down. Son of Man's going to be delivered up to be crucified. They didn't understand. It just didn't. Maybe I don't know what they thought he was talking about, but they didn't understand it. Luke 19, verse 11, Jesus tells the parable he tells us the parable of the nobleman going to a far country because there were some there who thought the kingdom would immediately appear, which would be the disciples. Because in John chapter 14 and then later on in John chapter 16 in the upper room, John tells us all that we read in that story that they did not understand that Jesus was leaving. And Jesus said, I'm going to my Father. You know, where are you going? Oh, we can come. No, you can't. I'm going away. They didn't understand that Jesus was leaving. They didn't understand that Jesus needed to be crucified. John 20 says that, so when Peter and John go to the tomb, they've heard these things from the women, they go to the tomb, it says that as yet they knew not the scriptures, that Jesus should be raised. They didn't understand that Jesus was to be resurrected. And of course, we know about the two on the road to Emmaus that said, you know, we thought he was about to establish the kingdom, and we, the disappointed hopes of those on the road to Emmaus. And even after the resurrection in Acts chapter 1 and verse 6, it says that Jesus had to leave, and they didn't understand that. They, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel, and that Jesus was leaving. So I think one of the things that comes out of this, whatever we think about what the coming of the sign of the coming of the Lord and the end of the world, is that at this stage the disciples didn't believe Jesus was going. So this whole idea of coming, maybe the way we think about the coming of Christ, because we think about the second coming of Christ, which is still future, because we know the Lord is gone, because he's not here. We know he's coming back. But they didn't think he was going. So maybe I need to think differently about what they meant or what they understood by the coming of the Lord at that time and the end of the world. So, because what I am going to suggest is that the coming of the Lord here is not the second coming of Jesus, which is still future to us, but that the coming of the Lord and the end of the world is the same as these things, as described by Mark and Luke, which is the destruction of the Jewish temple and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman armies in AD 70. That is in fact a coming of the Lord which brought the end of the Jewish age. So in verse 3 of Matthew 24, the end of the world, so the word for world is the word aeon, which means age. We probably need to we may actually do this next class, just spend a little bit of time on the different Greek words for world, because there's three of them. They're all used in the Olivet prophecy, and it's useful to know which one's which and what they mean, because they've got different meanings. But this one's the word for age, which could be applied, which can mean the Jewish age, so the age from Moses, so 1500 BC to AD 70. In fact, you look up the word aeon. There's some really useful actually uses of it, because sometimes in the same verse, Jesus uses it. So, for example, Jesus talks about the children of this world marrying a given marriage. It's the children of this age. But those who are counted worthy of the age to come, the world to come, so it's the same word aeon, the world to come, neither marry nor are given in marriage. And so in those two verses, Jesus is talking about an age that currently exists, and he's talking about a future age, that is the kingdom age. So anyway, so that's probably, we might look at that in a bit more detail next week. But just to say that that's the word that's used here, the end of the world, the end of the age. That they're coming. And I think we can say that this is actually this idea of of the Lord coming in judgment is actually very, very clear teaching, both in the Old Testament, and I think we'll see that even the way the Lord uses this concept in the Gospels, and then the way the apostles use it in the New Testament, I think we can see that actually this is the same idea that's being used, that the Lord coming in judgment is and as such, is actually a coming of the Lord. That AD 70 is a coming of the Lord when he brought the Romans to judge Judah, destroy Jerusalem, and in the Mosaic system. So let's just dive back into the Old Testament for a wee bit, and I'll just put the quotes up on the screen. But again, this is just a sample, because I think once you see this, you realise that actually we actually read about this quite a bit in the prophets. So sometimes we read about the Lord coming, but probably if you're familiar with the authorized version, because I don't know whether this word's used in other translations, maybe it is, then probably the word that you might more commonly think of in the Old Testament is visitation, or visiting, that God's going to visit his people, or you didn't know the days of your visitation, which is talking about which describes like a coming of the Lord. So here's just a sample talking about how God used the nations to bring about judgment, mostly on his people Israel. So the first one I just want to draw your attention to is Isaiah chapter 10 and verses 3 and 5. Now here in Isaiah chapter 10, it talks about the coming judgment. There's Isaiah, so it's around the time of Ahaz and Hezekiah, so we've gone way back into Jewish history. And he's talking about what you'll do in the day of visitation. By the way, what does it say in the NIV in verse 3? Oh, you're looking at something else.
The day of reckoning.
The day of reckoning. Okay, so day of reckoning. So King James is visitation, the NIV is the day of reckoning. What will you do in the day of visitation, the desolation which will come from far? So this is talking about the judgment to come. And then verse 5 says, O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, the staff in their hand is mine indignation. I will send him against a hypocritical nation, against the people of my wrath. Will I give him a charge to take the spoil and tread them down like mire in the streets, and all those sort of things. And Brother Justin talked about this particular, actually quite a bit of time in chapter 10, when he talked about when he did the class on Isaiah. But God talks about the Assyrian being his tool to bring judgment on the wicked, hypocritical nation of Israel, which they were to do. Around a similar time, so Micah prophesies at a similar time to Isaiah, and in chapter 1, he talks about the coming Assyrian judgment on Judah and Israel. And he says in verse 3, he says, Behold, Yahweh comes forth out of his place and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth. And the mountains shall be molten under him, and the valleys shall be cleft as wax before the fire, and as the waters that are poured down into a steep place. For the transgression of Jacob is all this. And then he's going to make Samaria a heap. And so here we've got in Micah chapter 1, we've got a description of Yahweh coming in judgment against Samaria and then also against Jerusalem. And yet Isaiah told us that the way that judgment would come would be by the Assyrian armies and the Assyrian king. In fact, if we flick forward a couple of pages to the book of Nahum, which is actually a prophecy against Assyria, so we've moved forward a little bit in time. Nahum chapter 1. So this is actually not anything to do with Judah. This is the judgment that's going to come on Assyria because of what they did to Judah and Israel. And this would be outworked by the Babylonians and the Medes. So in Nahum chapter 1, it says that in verse 3, it says, Well, verse 2 says, God is jealous and Yahweh revenges. Yahweh revenges and is furious. Yahweh will take vengeance on his adversaries. He will reserve wrath for his enemies. Yahweh is slow to anger and great in power and will not at all acquit the wicked. Yahweh has his way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry, and dries up all the rivers. Bashan languishes, and Carmel and the flower of Lebanon languish. The mountains quake at him, and the hills melt, and the earth is burned up at his presence. Yea, the world and all that dwell therein. Who can stand before his indignation? Who abide the fierceness of his anger? His fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by him. And it goes on. But here we've got the prophet describes the coming of Yahweh against Assyria. But the way Assyria was destroyed, the Assyrian Empire was destroyed, was by the confederacy of the Babylonians and the Medes, led by young Prince Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 4 uses the language of visitation about God coming against Judah. So now we've gone forward, now we're talking about the Babylonians coming to judge Jerusalem and Judah, the wickedness of Judah. And he says in chapter 4, he says in verse 23, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, the birds of the heavens were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of Yahweh and by his fierce anger. For thus says Yahweh, the whole land shall be desolate, yet I will not make a full end. So Jeremiah here talks about the coming Babylonian judgment on Judah as something that was done in the presence of Yahweh. And if we come forward to Joel chapter 2, just by way of illustration, Joel chapter 2 actually has a very interesting description for us here, where he says, talks about the, so again, the coming destruction is going to be executed by the Babylonians, so the Babylonian judgment on Jerusalem, where he says in verse 1 of chapter 2, blow the trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm in my holy mountain, that all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of Yahweh comes, it is near at hand. They have darkness and gloominess and so on. So then there's a whole description of the army that's going to come. But verse 11 says, and Yahweh shall utter his voice before his army, for his camp is very great, for he is strong that executes his word. For the day of Yahweh is great and very terrible. Who can abide it? And here, Joel describes the army of the king of Babylon as Yahweh's army. But Yahweh utters his voice before his army that's going to come and destroy Jerusalem. And that was the Babylonian army at that time. And the last place I'd like us to go, and we're going to come back here a bit later, is in Daniel chapter 9, which is the 70 weeks prophecy. So we've got all these things, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail when we come to that section of the Olivet prophecy, which is quoting from Daniel chapter 9. But just to notice that this is in harmony with the with what we've seen so far, that there's 70 weeks determined on the people and the holy city to do some things, verse 24, and then it says, talks about the coming of Messiah the Prince in verse 25. The going forth of commandment to build Jerusalem to Messiah the Prince there's some time. And then it says that in verse 26, after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end the war desolations are determined. And so I think here we've got a prophecy that the people of the prince that shall come is a reference to the people that are Messiah. It says Messiah the prince. He's the prince that is coming. And the people that are going to execute this judgment are going to be the Roman armies, which are going to desolate Jerusalem at that time. So we'll come back to Daniel chapter 9 and when we get to the abomination of desolation and go through that in a bit more detail. But just see that it's consistent with the Old Testament language and description of the coming of the Lord. When God comes, that God's going to come in judgment. And so in the New Testament period, where judgment is committed to the Son, as he says in John chapter 5, that it is the Lord Jesus who's going to come in judgment in this way against Jerusalem. So let's just have a look at so this is in the Gospel. So we have a bit of a look at that in the Old Testament and seeing that Old Testament description of the coming, what it means for the Lord to come. But here we've got, these are all from the Gospels. So this is obviously the first one is John the Baptist. I don't know whether you've ever thought about when John the Baptist speaks to the Pharisees, he warns them, generation of vipers, who's warned you to flee from the wrath to come? What wrath to come was John talking about? He's talking about the destruction that he knew was coming, because he goes on to say that the one who's coming, who's mightier than John, is going to gather up his wheat into his barn. He's going to burn the chaff with unquenchable fire. There's a fiery judgment to come, and you scribes and Pharisees need to be ready for it, because he's coming. It's this one. So that's John the Baptist. In Luke chapter 18, when in the parable of the unjust judge, when Jesus talks about how the unjust judge, eventually got around to avenging the widow, and the Lord says, well, shall not God avenge his elect who cry to him day and night? I tell you, he will avenge them speedily. And then he ends that parable with saying, nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, shall he find the faith on the earth? So Jesus here in this parable is talking about a speedy vengeance for the elect that cry to him, tied together with the coming of the Son of Man. This idea. Matthew chapter 13, the parable of the wheat and the tares. Obviously, this is evidence itself, but it talks about it uses similar language to what John the Baptist used and what's in the Olivet prophecy about the end of the world. So we may end up coming back to the parable of the wheat and the tares, but it's a parable about the end of the world, and that's the world cosmos, the end of this arrangement. In Matthew chapter 21, this is recorded in the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the parable of the vineyard. And just in the parable of the vineyard, I don't know whether you've ever noticed, but it says, when therefore the Lord of the vineyard comes, what will he do? So in the parable, I appreciate it's a parable, but in the parable there is a coming of the Lord of the vineyard for judgment. He's going to destroy those murderers and let out the vineyard to others. But there's a coming of the Lord of the vineyard. In Matthew chapter 22, in the parable of the wedding feast, it might actually just be worth opening this one up in Matthew chapter 22. So the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king that made a marriage for his son. And so he sends out his servants to invite those to the wedding, and they make excuses. And then it says, verse 6, the remnant, they took his servants and treated them spitefully and slew them. And verse 7 says, but when the king thereof heard, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city. And then he says to his servants, the wedding's ready, but those which were bidden were not worthy. Go out into the highways and byways. So there's a time after those murderers in their cities is burnt up, where there's still more gathering of guests to be done. So I think this parable is very interesting because it appears to give us an indication that there's this time of gathering those who are not part of the original invited group. Because then there's a judgment afterwards where it says that the king came and that there was a guest who didn't have a garment. And there's this later judgment scene at the end of the wedding. So there's the destruction of the city component and the end for those original guests. And then there's these other guests. So probably come back to this one, but just like to point that out to you. And in Matthew chapter 10, so Matthew chapter 10, verse 23, so Matthew 10 is the sending out of the 12 disciples to preach. But Jesus makes this interesting comment in there, because he talks and he says that he gives them advice about, well, what do you do when you're being persecuted? This is clearly much bigger advice than just the short amount of time that the disciples went out during the ministry to preach. This is advice that's going to be preparing them for afterwards, even though they don't even realise that yet. So he says that you'll be persecuted from city to city, brother shall deliver up brother to death, you'll be hunted in the synagogues, but he that endures to the end shall be saved. So we've got very much Olivet prophecy language. This is much earlier in the ministry. In verse 23 it says, but when they persecute you in this city, flee to another. But verily I say unto you, ye shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come. So here in Matthew 10, the Lord talks about this coming of the Son of Man, and the disciples won't have time or won't have been able to preach the gospel in all the cities of Israel. And again, we're going to come back to this when it talks about preaching the gospel in all the world, because in the Olivet prophecy it says that the gospel is going to be preached in all the world and then the end comes. But whilst that happens, the gospel is not preached in every city in Israel, which gives us an indication of the opposition which they were going to face at preaching in Israel, which wasn't faced so much in the other preaching. So anyway, we will look at, but it's just but the Lord here talks about his coming before they've gone over all the cities of Israel. So that's the Lord's teaching, talking about this coming for judgment. Now, of course, the Lord talks about a future coming as well. So I'm not saying that every time it talks about the Lord talks about his coming that he's talking about AD 70. It was obviously the day of the resurrection, that's still future. But there is a set of verses where the Lord talks about this earlier coming and a coming for judgment. Now, I'm not going to take us through all of these, but you're welcome to have a look. So in the letters of the apostles, there's an interesting set where they talk about the last days, and they talk about the coming of the Lord. And one of the things to note about this particularly is that this idea, and again, so this is the idea of a soon coming, an imminent coming of the Lord, and particularly a coming of the Lord for judgment. Now, is there anything that you notice about these particular letters?
Hebrews is easy.
Well, I gave it to you on the thing. These letters are all written to the Jewish believers. So whether they were Jews in the land of Israel or whether they were Jews that were scattered abroad, like Peter, or, but they're all written to the Peter writes to the 12 tribes who are scattered abroad. They're all written to Jews, and so this idea of this imminent coming of Jesus, coming of the Lord for judgment, is something that is, and this idea of the last days, that they're in the last days, that is the last days of Judah, the Jewish nation, is something that's particularly directed towards Jewish believers, because they particularly needed to be warned not to be drawn back into the Mosaic system. In fact, that's actually what the whole letter to Hebrews is about. The whole letter to Hebrews is about saying you need to leave Jerusalem. You need to be ready to leave the city when the time comes. There's no salvation in the Mosaic system. It's over. Salvation is only in Jesus, and you need to go out of the city. Like, that's actually what the whole letter of Hebrews is about, convincing Jewish believers that they needed to leave that behind because judgment's coming. Now, I guess the exception to that is that First and Second Thessalonians talk about the coming of the Lord. In fact, we know they've talked about coming of the Lord so imminent that people were quitting their jobs, and and then Paul had to write Second Thessalonians to them and say, no, hold on. Actually, it's not quite as imminent as all of that. And it may be that may be related to the intensity of the Jewish persecution in Thessalonica, which Acts 17 talks about the intensity of the Jewish persecution. But I just want to mention that's a letter to a Gentile ecclesia, which does talk in that way. Probably the only one I'd just like to go to here briefly is just to James chapter 5, because James in his letter, at the end of his letter in chapter 5, talks about, go weep and howl, rich men, you've heaped up silver and gold, you've heaped up treasure together for the last day. It's verse 3, it's the last days. But he talks about them defrauding, keeping back the wages of their labourers, and that's coming to the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. And that's a transliteration of the Hebrew word, which is we normally think about like the God of armies, the God of hosts, the Lord of Sabaoth. And then goes on all about the things that they've done. And then verse 7 he says, be patient therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husband waits for the precious fruit of the earth and has long patience for it until it receive the early and latter rain. Verse 8, be ye also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draws near. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge stands before the door. And then he goes on to talk about the prophets. But here in James chapter 5, James talks about this imminent coming of the Lord, and this coming of the Lord for which the believers need to be patient because they would be avenged, because they were being oppressed, that they needed to be patient for this coming. He talks about this coming of the Lord. So, all of which is to say that I think in Matthew 24 and verse 3, when the disciples say, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world, that the disciples are asking about, and Jesus answers about, the destruction of Jerusalem, which is going to come in AD 70. So
So they were effectively asking when you going to come with power
The judge.
to judge and to take rulership.
Well, taking rulership, maybe so we know that they believed that the kingdom was immediately to appear. So they may have thought that. To overthrow the Romans. So it's all of those things going. So one verse that I didn't go to actually here, which is the last one, just to note. So when Jesus answers to Caiaphas, and he says, tell us, are you the Son of the Blessed? Jesus says, yes. And hereafter you'll see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. You will see it. So this appears to be a reference to the coming in judgment.
I probably felt he'd been a bit too passive up to this point, and they were looking for someone to be with power.
Yeah. So, but just like the disciples didn't understand, the multitude of the people didn't really understand. Didn't understand either. They, like I said, they were looking for someone to overthrow the Romans and establish the glories of Israel. They weren't looking for someone to be a sacrifice for sin and offering for sin. They didn't understand that in God's purpose, actually, God's purpose was bigger than like whether they had a nice kingdom or not. Actually, what needed to be dealt with now was sin, but as a consequence of what was going to happen and the nation's rejection of Jesus, they would reject Jesus, they would reject the apostles, is that there would be a judgment for that. And the other outcome of that is, so there's the vengeance for and judgment for the rejection and the spiteful treatment of the apostles and the Christians. But the other thing is, that other effect of the destruction in AD 70 is that the Mosaic system, the ceremonies, the offerings, everything about that is completely finished. It's ended. There's no possible going back to the Mosaic order. Like it's over. And so that time, and you've got to remember that for the people listening to it, and I'm sure for the disciples, it was something that was unfathomable. Moses was 1,500 years ago. Well, they lived under the Mosaic system for like 30 generations. I think for us, I know certainly for myself, it's a challenge to quite grasp the cataclysmic enormity of what Jesus was talking about to the disciples. Like just how significant and how earth-shattering this idea was, and that they just couldn't grasp it. It's actually just such a major deal. So I realise I've been going for over an hour. So if you like some homework, the Lord draws a lot on the last words of Moses. So Deuteronomy 28, and in particular, the Olivet prophecy draws particularly on the section of Deuteronomy 28, verse 48 to 63. Obviously, it merges into, comes out of one and merges into the other. So a little bit before, a little bit after. But the particularly on this section, which talks about the judgment that's going to come. And so this is, again, so 1500, Moses was about in the 15th century BC. So 1500 years before, God showed to Moses, here's the story of the nation of Israel that's still to come in the broad sweep of things. And here's this, and we've got the section on the Roman destruction, as opposed to verse 36 and 37, which talks about when there's a king. But because by the time we come to 48 and 63, there's no king, or no Jewish king anyway. So I'll leave it there. And next week, so next week or next class, is it next week? It is next week. Next week, what we'll do is, I think we probably go through fairly rapidly, is we'll just walk through the Olivet prophecy and we'll just see how that's outworked. Because even within the scriptural record, we can see how that was outworked and how that happened in the story of the first century, and then we can also have a look at some things about what we can learn from the Olivet prophecy and what that means for us. But I guess there's kind of, there's two things, I think. The first is that God hasn't promised his people an easy life. And the second is that even though sometimes it appears unlikely, God's purpose is going to happen. And the things that God has spoken will come to pass, including the Lord's reappearance, and the gathering of all the saints and the establishment of his kingdom on earth. So that's probably a good place to finish. I know we've only dealt with the first 2 verses, but I think we'll be able to motor through the rest.
3 verses.
3 verses. I think we'll be able to motor through the rest pretty quickly. Okay. Well, shall we? Okay, I'll just go stop the recording.